All right, well, we're going to kick it off. And I know people will be kind of trickling in as we get started. And we did want to give everybody a heads up. We know one of our panelists, Sarah Wadamura, she is a busy human on campus with all that's going on with COVID. And so she will be joining us momentarily. But for right now, we have two amazing community members on the line with us, and we will go ahead and get started. But as we settle into the quarter, welcome. Welcome back to our Community Plus Values Community Talks. This will be the first one of the quarter and one of many to come. We'll actually have our first partnership one with Heritage Months next Thursday around Latinx Heritage Months, and we're really excited about that. And for now, we will start with our Coming Back Together webinar, a celebration of our DU community. And so we're super excited. We have Shelly Smith Acuna and Mason Estes on the line with us and on video. But first, one of the things that C+V is dedicated to, a few things are building community, inclusion, and belonging on campus. And so one thing we like to start every event with is a land acknowledgement. And so, in the spirit of healing and peace, and to acknowledge and honor the indigenous peoples of the land upon which DU stands, the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute tribes, to acknowledge that DU now sits is the ancestral homeland of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, of whose loss we both recognize and mourn. So like the history of so many institutions in the American West, ours is a complex and sometimes painful history. In recognition of this fact, and to underscore our commitment to inclusion and equity, we commit to listen and affirm the stories of all in our community. And so we want to take a moment, take a breath together, and realize that C+V is here for every single community member, and we honor and respect that and want to amplify the stories of all of those. With that, I am honored to introduce our panelists for today as we talk about coming back together, kind of the high of what that feels like, how excited we feel, how anxious and nervous we might feel as well. And we go from this virtual world all the way into this in-person world and kind of in between on so many things. So first, I want to introduce Mason Estes. He is the undergraduate student body vice president, and Mason is a La Jolla band, Luciano indigenous tribal member from Southern California, and he comes from Broomfield, Colorado. Mason is a fourth-year marketing student in a Daniels College of Business and is serving as the 2021-2022 undergraduate student body vice president. Mason is the son of two teachers and looking to pursue a future in community organizing and continuing the struggle for indigenous civil rights in the 21st century. So welcome, Mason. I also want to welcome Shelly Smith Acuna. We were just talking about Shelly was one of the first people who joined our C+V webinars when we first started these back in March of last year, which feels like 5 years ago. Shelly is the Dean of the Graduate School of Professional Psychology at DU and has been at DU for the last 29 years. So that's awesome to see. She holds leadership positions on the University Women's Leadership Council, the Chancellor's Diversity Advisory Council, the Community and Values Initiative, and the Health Initiative. Her leadership focuses on addressing pressing psychological issues by expanding the accessibility and relevance of GSPP's education and training programs, as well as affordable community-based services. So welcome, Shelly. We're so glad to have you on another one of our webinars here. Super honored to have you in this space. And then we will also be having Sarah joining us. And it looks like actually that Sarah is in the audience. So we're going to make her panelist here really quick. And our wonderful IT folks in the background who we want to thank so much who help us put this on there. If we wouldn't mind making Sarah a panelist, that would be wonderful. Sarah is a professor and the chair of the psychology department at DU. She is part of the developmental and developmental cognitive neuroscience areas within the psychology department. Hey, Sarah, good to see you on video here. In 2014, she was instrumental in creating the Stress Early Experiences and Development Research Center, also known as SEED, and has served as co-director since its creation. So thank you so much for coming, Sarah. We were just giving you a shout out. We know you've done so much for the community over the last year and a half with your COVID response and everything in between. And so we are so grateful to have all three of you on the webinar with us today. And what a year and a half it's been. We talk about one of the guiding principles for C+V is honoring the spirit of Sankofa. And so always looking back in order to go forward and honoring the tension between the past and the present. So as we look back at this time, we want to first ask, how did you all see the DU community showing up for each other over this last year and a half, and how they continue to show up for each other? And Shelley, I'll kick it to you in honor of being the first guest there.
Yeah, thanks for having me and for all the support, Chase, but also to Hiba and Tremaine and just all the whole team that brings us together. And I think teamwork is maybe the name of the game when we look at what happened in this past year and a half. I, of course, have to give a gigantic shout out to Sarah and also Corrine, Kim, Garrigan, like the whole COVID team has been absolutely amazing. And it was funny because when I saw the title of this webinar, like a celebration of the DU community, it frankly is a little bit hard to feel celebratory the way that I expected the fall to feel celebratory. I think the idea that we were going to say, wow, we were victorious, we licked this thing, that maybe that I didn't expect that it was going to be quite that clear, but that we would be closer to that. And yet the celebration is really that I trust this place more than ever, that I admire my colleagues more than ever, that I'm proud of my students more than ever. And so seeing, I mean, I really do, I'll let Sarah talk. She can describe exactly what they've done. But anytime I'm in a different setting where I'm hearing about how COVID is being handled, DU is always at the top. The combination of really using very logical strategies that balance safety with being together and are thorough and thoughtful and well documented and well communicated. The whole package that we're doing here is exactly what, frankly, I'd want to see in a university, and not just in a university, for me, in a workplace and a place that I ask students to come. So I think it's okay for me to say this as a psychologist, the very deep sanity in the way this has been approached has been really powerful. And I'm very grateful just to all of the scaffolding and the comprehensive approach in managing our safety and keeping the operation moving.
Thank you so much, Shelley. And Sarah, I'm going to pass the mic to you as well as you think about some of that and other ways you've seen the DU community show up.
Yeah, happy to reflect on that. So in the past 12 months, 18 months, it has been we've overused all the words, right? Unprecedented, incredibly challenging, all of that. But in fact, that's all really true. And it is not just because of the pandemic. It has been an extremely bifurcating time. It has been, COVID has amplified the deep structural inequities that we have all throughout our country and world, and that continues to be really pressingly obvious. For example, vaccine distribution equity. So I think what has stood out for me most in the COVID response has been the way that the community has come together. I literally work with people every day that I didn't know at all, and I've been at DU for 15 years. And it's not necessarily who you might think or who you might expect or defined by their role. It's really been it's just really been people who've come together to challenge and support and listen and all of those things. And I would say all aspects of that have been super valuable. So I really value my colleagues who have said, I'm really scared about this, or I really don't understand this, or why can't we do it this way? As much as I value my colleagues who've, shown up to volunteer for every event. And I think the culture of having a real communication, and I hope people feel that it has been a real communication where people have brought concerns or issues, and we've said, okay, well, we didn't think of it that way. Let's try to figure out how one would even get an institution to respond to that particular concern, right? In a very quickly shifting landscape. There are I don't know, probably a good 40 people that I have to call in the night on the weekend, much more often than I wish, to ask them to do their special skill and bring their special talent to bear, for the safety of everyone. And unfailingly to a person, they have stepped up to do that. I think I start almost every conversation with, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry to have to ask you to do this, but here we are again. And I look forward honestly to the day where, we aren't stretching each other so much. And I see that across, not just with the people acutely involved in the response, but because of the incredible toll, the circumstances that we have been in globally, both because of the pandemic and because of our awareness of things that have been deeply painful and in every possible way harmful, has been really brought even more to the fore. And it's very hard to be so involved in a response that no matter what we do contains these inequities. So for example, the university got involved in the vaccine process, in part because the only way to get a vaccine was to go into an online waiting list. And so we said at the university, listen, we're able to make a bunch of phone calls, knock on doors. People across this university speak a lot of different languages. Let's lean in and see if we can help with this. But just the way it started, oh, sure, put yourself on an online waiting list. That doesn't exclude anybody, right? I mean, of course, and all of those early calls where we were talking to 80-year-olds who have no idea how to put themselves on an online waiting list. I mean, many do, but that kind of thing. So I have also really loved to see the way that we've leaned into our public good values and not just reined in to supporting our own community, but really tried to broaden our sense of community.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate it. And a shout out to everybody who are on those calls, like 24 hours doing the work. It's such a huge impact for the community. So thank you to you and all the team across DU and everybody that's done that. And Mason, I want to hand it off to you to hear your experiences and your point of view of how you saw the DU community show up for each other this past year and a half.
Definitely. And I think that is such a complex question because I think we frame it as this last year and a half, but how much has happened in the last year and a half outside of COVID, outside of, some of the things we're seeing across our country, across our planet, that all of these kind of added these pressures to students, and the way they showed out for each other from at least the student perspective really evolved over that year and a half. I heard and experienced in my own ways stories of true struggle. Students really being put in these situations where you have to make the decision: do I want to stay in school and do online, or do I take a gap year and come back when maybe things calm down? Seniors who are graduating and they're saying, well, I'm not going to be able to experience these things. But also just these incredible stories of students in the face of a lot of questions in the beginning. I think back to March of not last year, but the year before, when we got the first announcement that we would be leaving campus. At this time I was a sophomore. I was living in Nagel Hall, and we had a floor meeting. Our RA sat us down and said, this is our protocols. This is what's happening. I know you're all about to go out for spring break. We'll probably be back in 2 weeks at full capacity. And I think back to kind of how many questions we all had, but in that moment, it was, what are we going to do about it? And the responses from the students ranged everywhere from, hey, do you need to borrow some money to buy a ticket home? To, hey, I live in state. Do you need to store some of your stuff at my house? Like my parents' house, like stored in the basement. So that way you don't have to worry about paying for storage, or you can come back in the summer and come get it if that's how it goes. And it was entire groups of people who I had never even seen interact before. And people were saying, I could rely on my peers. I could go into a class and say, hey, I've never taken an online final before. Does anyone have advice for how to take a final for this class? And people providing those resources. I think about how that transformed over last year, which was really the whole extent of that long-term digital impact of being 100% remote, or as you started to go into hybrid, but the amount of students who I heard were, reaching out to each other often, setting up Zoom hangouts where everyone would get to be together and just talk, even though we're spread out across the country. Um, even being there for each other as students to say, hey, what classes are you taking? Oh, I might recommend taking this class because maybe it'll be a little bit easier to take remotely and adjusting your schedule. That being said, we cannot underestimate the impact of faculty and staff that had on students, the amount of professors who would begin every class with, hey, we don't have to talk about it here, but if you need anything, please send me an email. Don't have to be a full-blown conversation about it, but if you need accommodation, if you need help in any way, resources at all, please reach out. And it was this idea that from a student's perspective, we are oftentimes 20-year-olds charged with the responsibility of navigating these spaces, getting the information from our administrators and getting our information from our professors and acting on it, which sounds simple, but in practice is very daunting because a lot of times mistakes that we might make during this time could be very impactful. And seeing the bravery with which students were able to move forward, the bravery in which they said, this is not going to be the thing that stops me from achieving my goals academically, personally, it was inspiring. And that is kind of the best way I can think of it. And now going into, this last summer, just that hopefulness and really students encouraging each other to say, hey, I know this last year and a half has been hard, but keeping that hope, keeping that mentality that says, we will be all right. And that mentality really was shared between all students across this campus for these last year and a half. But it was incredible.
That's so cool to hear. Yeah, I remember thinking in March of last year, like there's just nothing there to support. So it's people just lifting each other up. And then as we settled into these, these terms, like Sarah was saying, this new normal, we saw people shifting in a way that felt powerful. And obviously there was a lot of really tough things, a lot of sadness, but also it did feel like there were different maybe balances or connections. And so Mason, I'm going to hand it back over to you because you were kind of talking about this as we think towards the future and we think back and now towards the future. Are there any different balances or connections of ways of being together that you witnessed or you're thinking about?
Going forward or in the last year and a half?
Going forward, you had mentioned these ways. I love the ways you were talking about how people were checking in with each other and kind of just asking each other. But do you see a shift in balances or connections or ways of being together as we look forward?
I do. I see a greater emphasis on the accountability that we have within each other to check in with each other. I think, and it was always there to some extent, but I don't think I've ever seen such intentionality with the idea of students saying, hey, let's grab coffee and just like talk self-care. Like, how are we taking care of each other? How are we? Friends who I always laugh because they'll text me like, hey, just checking in, like, have you eaten today? And I'm like, what in the world? Like, that's so great. Like, I love that we have those types of things that are so small. But those have become a lot more prevalent in relationships that maybe I wouldn't expect that in the past. But also there's this new bravery in the sense of everyone experienced some struggle during this last year and a half. Everyone experienced something that really challenged, whether it was their character, whether it was their resolve, or whether it was their identities as people. I think it's those struggles and those challenges made us to realize the compassion we can share with one another. So when we sit across from somebody, whether it's in a class or whether it's in social environments, we can really say like, I know what I went through. I wonder what they went through. And there's a newfound respect for everybody went through this challenge. Everybody really has that right for that respect that I think is innate and should always have been there. But I think it's been put into terms where everyone says, everyone went through something and I want to know about that. I want to respect that. There's this newfound kind of want to see like, oh, well, I wonder how you've changed. Who were you before March 2 years ago? Who are you now? Like, there's an interesting dynamic there, which I find really fascinating, but really encouraging. A lot of people being friends and conversating that, forging new friendships, forging new relationships, which is very cool.
That's so awesome. Yeah, I remember we got a brand new baby and I had to have him on a Zoom call, and someone was like, that shows our culture. Like, show up, have the baby on the Zoom call. And I thought, like, I don't know if that would happen like a year and a half ago. And so I thought that was a really cool learning moment. And Shelley, I'd love to hear your perspectives from your position on campus in these different areas and working with so many of, are there different balances, connections, and ways of being together that you've witnessed?
Well, I want to highlight some of what Mason said, because I think it was just so spot on. The idea of really being intentional about checking in with each other. And one of the things that I have found really interesting as people are back in my building after being there pretty much by myself, there's kind of a less conscious, as you're physically with people, sometimes there's just a way of connecting that's not as intentional, and you kind of pick up on that body language and so forth. And yet, what I really liked about what Mason said is that in addition to those nonverbals and kind of the unconscious ways that maybe you connect when you kind of can be face to face, what COVID has taught us is to take that extra step, to go ahead and to say, how are you doing? To make the time, to say, let's not only check in case you're struggling, but let's process this together. So one of the things that I think moving forward, hopefully we do that more. And I will say that the fairly universal response that I've seen as we're trying to be more in person is just that the exhaustion isn't gone, that people need to process, that you think, oh, it's going to feel great to be back. And all of a sudden, it's great to be back. And at the same time, it's strange to be back. And then you have the decisions, well, what should be done virtually if you've learned something about pedagogy in some classes? And how do you have the mental energy to say, actually, I want to turn this class into hybrid because this particular part of the course really lends itself to an online format. And I think that gets to that wish that we could say, oh, let's just go back and it'll be easy again. And it's not easy again, but to say it's okay that it's not easy again because we're checking in with each other, because we're being intentional, because we can really lean on our community, and we're going to need to continue to lean on our community going forward. I guess the other plug that I would make about what Mason said about everybody struggling and kind of normalizing that conversation. As you can imagine, graduate school professional psychology, our clinical services are more sought out than ever, even though they're all pretty much virtual still. And to recognize that it's really completely acceptable, destigmatized to say, I need extra support, whether that's psychotherapy or more friendship or however you get that extra support. Self-care is not a fluffy word anymore. Thank goodness. That can be something that's just part of what people learn while they're here at DU.
Yeah, that's I love that. And I come from life before this as a counselor, and I thought that was one of the things. I was reading an article that I thought was most powerful, is that the virtual world provided more opportunities for people to be able to get mental health care who hadn't been able to get it, particularly in rural areas or areas where they may not be able to drive back and forth if they've got to work, but they can jump on a 20-minute call. And I thought that was really powerful. Same thing with the virtual meeting setup of, there are opportunities for people who might be able to not make a meeting or not have their voice heard, but now they can join that Zoom call from the kitchen table if they're making family dinner and do that. And so there's opportunities to be in person and be in community together, which is so needed and so powerful. But also there's some opportunities to learn from that. So yeah, that's amazing. And Sarah, I'm curious, as you look to the future, you've got so many lessons learned, I'm sure, up there in your head of, are there different balances or connections of ways of being together that you imagine after all this is done someday?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I mentioned, I've been here a long time, and I think there has been, I don't know, Shelley, I'm curious your perspective, sort of an undercurrent of, I don't know, like, it would be hard to do that here. We can't do that here. We don't have that thing here. We don't have the resources or whatever. And I'm historically, I'm in this temporary, like, Mary Read role, but I'm kind of a rabble rouser by temperament. And so, I sort of jokingly say, I like yes and I like now. You know, those are kind of my favorites. Can we work on yes and now? But we have done, you know, we have held our own with the very top schools in terms of response and outperformed many of the schools that we talk about as our aspirational schools. And it wasn't an accident. We have done that intentionally. And so it has helped me to think about just revisiting this undercurrent or this notion that we don't have what it takes to do X, Y, or Z change. I think because there was no playbook and because nobody had, you know, nobody knew what to do, in a way, it gave us a refresh opportunity to just say, we can make this work. And we did it with very thoughtful partnerships. You know, we have this really tight partnership with National Jewish Health, but we also have great partnerships with DDPHE and CDPHE. So we built in the pieces that we didn't own. And we brought to bear all of the talent that we do own, you know, people across campus with all kinds of different types of expertise that, you know, just sort of were like, well, I actually studied that. I mean, I don't know if you wanted to talk to me. I'm like, yes, we want to talk to you, you know, trying to integrate people in. So I feel like a big take home for me moving forward is to not start with the assumption that we can't do something, but to start with the assumption that we can do it, especially if we do it together with our intentional partners, and just starting with that baseline assumption, I think would be a really great thing to carry forward. And then I wanted to reflect a little bit on the thing that you said. While I love the fact that a hybrid or virtual environment increases access, I think the access piece is phenomenal and critically important. I do think there's a negative downstream consequence where it's as if you're never off. So I have been communicating to my department, for example, I am not going to do in this meeting that is not urgent. I'm not doing a hybrid option, because if you are doing something else and you can't be here, I would like you to do something else and not be here, right? Like, don't call me from the doctor's office. You're at the doctor's office, you know, and, you know, sure, if it's urgent and you really need to call in from the dinner table, okay. But like, you also need to make dinner with your family, right? So I think we could all do a round of really asking ourselves, is this a time where this increases access and intentional participation, or are we just so used to constantly trying to do all the things at the same time that I'm by default, you know, zooming in or calling into something that in pre-COVID times, I would have just said, I'm not available, right? So, because I feel like we're all getting sort of a low grade attention deficit issue where when you do try to concentrate or focus on something, it's very hard to do it because you have this, it's like you're an online gamer. You have this online game reality that's constantly tugging at your attention and trying to get you to like do all that stuff that, you know, answer that email or that IM or that whatever. So I do think as a community, it would be good to be intentional about using tools to improve and get the goals that we want, rather than letting the tools or the availability of the tools drive our behavior.
Oh my gosh, I love that, Sarah. And you are so right. Because I'll catch myself being like, you know, going to a doctor's appointment with my son, and I'm like, I'll just jump on the line. And it's like, you know, I don't need to be there, but there's a fear almost of missing out, or like I need to be there. And we were also, Shelly and I were planning an event together, and I'm in this state of urgency and frantic, like we need to support the community, but we could take a few weeks to really plan something thoughtfully. It's not so acute at this moment. And so thank you for that reminder. And it actually ties in really well to our next question, is that there's a lot of what we found is re-entry anxiety. And so there's a term for this, the stress, the fear, hesitancy, dread, discomfort, as we kind of navigate the unknown of like things can change, and we know they can change at the drop of a hat. And also that we're seeing people for the first time in a year and a half. We've been on this virtual space. Like you said, we're constantly on. And so I'm curious, Sarah, I'll start with you. How are you all feeling with that? And you kind of mentioned, and how can we navigate this? What does that look like?
I mean, I think that it is strange for literally everyone, right? So it's strange for people like Shelly and I. I mean, I'm here more. This is my home. I'm here all the time, right? And then it's strange for people who are, you know, it's like the town you grew up in when you go back to visit. You know, it's got that kind of funny feel to it. And then the in-between, and everybody trying to navigate that. I think from our perspective, we've tried to do everything we can to not only keep the environment as safe as possible, but be really transparent about that, so that at any point you can hop on the dashboard and look at the positivity. You'll get a vicinity notification that someone in your vicinity was positive, even though we're totally not required to do that, right? We're trying to do these things to give people a handle on it, a sense of it. And then I think unfortunately, like all things anxiety, the best treatment for anxiety is to do the thing. It's, you're afraid of elevators. The more you avoid elevators, the worse your fear of elevators get. And so from just a psychological standpoint, what we're looking at is ways to support people for brief engagement with the thing that is causing that anxiety in a way that they can, put some boundaries on it, put some control on it, and then increase the duration and the intensity of the thing that you're anxious about. So unfortunately, it's uncomfortable, right? But trying to think, okay, I'm really nervous about reentry. What are the can I identify what is it I'm really anxious about, right? I'm really anxious that there might be my close proximity. Hey, bop on the dashboard and look at the vaccination rate. You're probably pretty good. Okay, I'm anxious about being near people. So you could always sit further away, or you could say, for 15 minutes of this meeting, I'm going to sit nearer to people. And then next time I'll do it for 20 minutes, right? So just try to work yourself through that anxiety piece, rather than the tendency I think we all have, which is to avoid. It's very tempting to avoid things that you feel anxious or uncomfortable about. So trying to get real information on the one hand, like challenge your anxious assumptions, get real information, and then do it in bites that you can do. And then lots and lots of self-compassion and compassion for others, right? Because the emotions are not wrong. That's never wrong. It's just, how is it serving you? How can you get to your own goals and outcomes, and understanding that that's going to probably be a while for many people.
Yeah, absolutely. It was such a strange experience. It was the first time I'd ever actually been on campus, because I started right as literally the day we went to COVID, remote. And it left me with this feeling of anxiety around just being in the vicinity of people and talking. Even though they were joyful moments, there was still, that little thing in the back that was like, is this safe? And is someone coughing on me? Should I hold my breath? Like those little things that, the anxiety that creeps up. And Shelley, I'm curious, from your, background and your work, are there other things that you would talk about or recommend for folks, and how are you feeling?
Yeah, I, of course, ditto everything that Sarah said. Super helpful and hard to recognize that there's not a way around facing what's difficult here. And we can say simultaneously, we know human beings are not great at this. It's joyful and anxiety producing all at the same time. That's a lot to process. That is not easy. And so that's what I see, that like you think, oh, knowing all this in your head is going to make it easier. And it really doesn't. All of us are struggling. It doesn't take the struggle away. I do think I could add a couple of things to what Sarah said, in that, I mean, first of all, I already mentioned the communication, transparency, facts. There's so many things that you can say, I'm feeling anxious, and let me understand why, and let me get strategies for dealing with that. And we have a lot of good information about that. What I would add in the community is talking to each other about it, and not just sharing the feelings, but, if like I've been coming to campus, pretty much since the beginning, and the idea of saying, gosh, why am I not afraid to be here? Well, part of it is that I'm more accustomed to it. And it does go along with what Sarah said, that just the practice helps. But part of it is that, especially at the beginning, I was checking that stuff very carefully. I was comparing it against the state data, the city data, what was happening in other schools. And my trust of what DU is doing to keep the community safe is not blind faith. It is earned trust based on the behavior that I've seen. And so I can share that in conversations. I think we can all have those conversations to say, what are your strategies and why are you feeling better, or why are you feeling anxious? I also think that just using the relationship, not just the joy at seeing each other, but the relationship, again, in processing what we're going through, feeling like you're not going through something alone, of course, is one of the best antidotes to trauma. That feeling that you're facing a trauma by yourself is really difficult. And so this personal relationship that we have with each other can be a huge buffer, I think.
Yeah, that's what kind of ties into what you've all said. And Mason, you were talking about was that piece of just checking in on each other is a really powerful way. And there'll be times where it feels like a wave, like sometimes it feels really good. And then other times it feels like things may never be normal. But we ride those waves. And Mason, I'm curious, it's funny, I always am kind of from my own experiences thinking as a staff member and what that looks like, but students are right in the thick of it, in classes, in activities, trying to socialize. What does it look like for you all with kind of this reentry anxiety and your experiences, and how are you feeling personally, and how do we navigate this?
Right. And I don't mean to speak on behalf of all students at University of Denver. I could not hope to do that. But from conversations I've had and the conversations that I've had with myself in that sense, I'm very hopeful, incredibly hopeful, but also fairly skeptical. I think that is something that's very necessary going into what is the next phase of our time here at the university. How we talked about the idea of our trust within our university being well earned from the information we got, the support that was given, really seeing that transform into the next needs that we have for this next year. I think about after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and that whole summer, there was a lot of commitments made to the ways that we are going to change and hold ourselves accountable as an institution, as a community. When we talked about the focus on mental health and the idea of, making sure that people have what they need, or the support necessary for them to succeed. What does that look like now in this next year? So some skepticism around, will we back up the things that we've said in the past? But I'm incredibly hopeful because I'm already seeing those steps. I'm already seeing that implementation happen and seeing the evolution of some of these conversations. I know in conversations I've had with my peers and even myself in class on first week of school last week was an hour and 50-minute class is very hard to do when you're sitting there and looking at your professor, because you don't have your phone, you don't have another window open and you're looking at something else. It is very interesting that we had that conversation about if how we're doing meetings from now on, or how we're communicating with each other and being really intentional there. Students see that as well. I see it in student organizations. Do we make a Zoom option for our student organization, for our meetings weekly, or organizations who are trying to do recruitment? The idea of what is the safest way for us to approach students who maybe don't know us or are new to campus and they don't know why they should trust us yet. It is a difficult road to navigate, but a lot of hope in that. A lot of students have kind of this mentality of the mold is shattered. We don't have to come back to campus and act in the same way we were before. We don't have to come back to campus and there is that balance between tradition and innovation in the ways that we exist on this campus, and really seeing that bravery and that hope that a lot of students have, that there are things about our campus and the ways that we operate in the past that are great, but the things that weren't, this is the time that we can change them. This is the time that we can change the way that maybe identity-based organizations collaborate in a different level. Organizations that maybe wouldn't host certain events are now saying, well, let's change the way that we operate. Or students who say, and this is actually very interesting, is I have a friend of mine who said, I'm a Daniels College business student, I'm an accounting major, and I'm taking a philosophy class this quarter, because when I was in over the pandemic and over these last year and a half, all I thought about was I should learn something else. When I get back, I'm going to take a class in something I'm curious about, and I just want to learn. So there is that bravery and there is that hope that we can turn this experience into something that really builds off of where we left off.
No, that's what it's powerful to see. And our last question here today is about what are your wishes for the DU community? And Mason, I feel like you had some kind of awesome preliminary thoughts around that, but what are your wishes for the community, and what are some ways that we can celebrate each other? So one of the coolest things that I saw was just starting from kind of the brainchild and the work of Morgridge College of Education around the UROC Awards, and then Kate Willink and her team in the VPFA office expanded it to faculty, staff, and then C+V. Then we're asked, could we partner and bring this to the whole campus and students, alumni, faculty, staff, parents, everybody? And we did over a couple of weeks. And so it was really cool to be able to just celebrate each other on these little moments. And so what are your wishes for the community? How can we celebrate each other? If we have this chance to break the mold, how do we do it in a way that makes a difference for people?
100%. And Chase, you and I had a conversation this summer about how crazy it is that at the University of Denver, in a very unique way, you can pull anyone off the sidewalk and say, what do you do? And they say, oh, well, I'm the president of this club, or I'm involved in this, or I volunteer here. We're a campus full of just doers, people who are really motivated to do this. My wish is to kind of facilitate some spaces where we get to have that conversation with each other. Well, what are you working on? What have you achieved this year? What are your ambitions for next year? What are your, I think there's a lot of times where, especially from a student perspective, we're on the grindstone every day. When we're not doing our work in our organizations, we're in school. And it makes it kind of hard to say, well, I'm involved in all these things and I got a 3.8 this quarter, but unless I tell it to my direct friends, there's not a lot of celebration that comes around that for the average student, for the person there. So I guess one wish for me is the idea that we can highlight the very unique involvement of our students on this campus and highlight that to a point where it inspires other students to get involved. It inspires other students to succeed. My dad, how I said, both my parents were teachers. My dad is a baseball coach. And he always told me when I was growing up about the idea of a culture of excellence, the idea of if you show off what everyone's doing well, and if you embrace that and you're proud of that, then it makes you want to do better. And then through that snowball effect, it's an entire community of people who are rooting for each other's success. And in the end, that's kind of my biggest wish, is for us all to be back in that one big team mentality, one big family and one big community.
That's so awesome. I love that. And I'm wondering if Mason, if you had one specific example of how you might see new ways of celebrating each other, do you have any ideas from your perspective?
Very selfishly, just because I love events and I love getting dressed up, some type of like gala where we could all come together and do an event like that. But of course, it would have to be very well planned, very safe. But I don't know. I always love the idea of getting dressed up and seeing my friends all dressed up and getting to talk about the amazing work we're doing. So,
yeah, yep. That's one thing that I'm excited for, to get back into, are like the fervor around events. And we don't just have to be on the Zoom screen. We can be in person and have a lot of fun and celebrate together again. And Sarah, I want to kick it to you. And do you have any wishes for the DU community? What are some ways that we can celebrate each other?
Yeah, I mean, I think I like the idea of some variability in our, it's been really nice to see so many people back, right? And to see some of our, events we've always done. It might be a good time to just think about new ways that we might want to come together in person. I think I've noticed people using our beautiful outdoor space more than I had noticed. I mean, maybe I just didn't notice it before, but then I had noticed before. Just trying to think about, those opportunities to do that kind of thing. I've always really liked, and this doesn't work in a big setting, but in a small setting, the opportunity to do affirmations in person for people. So where you say, hey, I really want to say that you, Mason, for the way, right? Like you kind of give people space to do that kind of thing. That can be a really powerful tool in a smaller group, not in a huge thing. I think trying to think about, recognizing not just what people have done sort of in their traditional role on campus, but the way they've integrated their identities and their engagement on and off campus together is another really unique thing that I sometimes see, right? Somebody's able to weave in their participation in another group or community off campus, or because of an identity or identities they share. So I'd love to see us move forward in that space.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Shelley, one of my favorite conversations we had was how we get folks to kind of see themselves as part of the larger DU community and stay on campus and go to sporting events and performances. And I do get a sense like people are loving being back on campus, and we see a little bit more of hanging around and using these spaces. And so I'm curious, what would be your wishes for the DU community this year? What are some ways we could celebrate each other? And looking forward to this.
Yeah, I think we are going to have to find some new ways to listen to each other more deeply. Um, and again, I think the opportunity for a reset is really powerful. And my deepest hope is that we really listen to that. I mean, I talked a lot about the specific COVID response, but when we talk about, whether you frame it as the dual pandemics, just recognizing kind of the depth of racism and the other inequities in our culture, to finally face that and not make it a little bit better, but that, what's come out of this conversation to really make the deep structural changes. And frankly, I think, as we're planning events, to ask ourselves deeper questions. I have a lot of questions, and I think a lot of things that I need to listen to. This came out of our C+V meeting on Tuesday. So you heard this, Chase, saying, for me, my background is German. I love Oktoberfest. Any chance for people to get together for a brat and a beer is automatically a good time in my book. And that's very culturally grounded. That's not, so Oktoberfest, does that actually represent the whole DU community? How welcoming is that? How could that be built in a way that it felt like an identity, not just, that I say, wow, some year I'm going to wear my journal. It doesn't, that's very personal to me. And DU's not good at that real inclusive feel with, I think, most of the events that I see don't have that yet. So that's my deep hope, is that we follow through with that commitment and that we really try to look for new ways to make more room for all voices at DU.
And this is a perfect segue into a question that we had, and it kind of digs into, Mason, thank you for speaking into our virtual space here about, the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Elijah McClain and all these folks who made a commitment to these structural changes. And then it felt like we kind of just, people got worn down and worn down and worn down over this last year and a half. And so as we do come back in campus together, and I was in a meeting with Kristen Deal the other day from ODI, and she said, we're really good at treating symptoms, but how do we get to the root causes of things? And it was such a question that stuck into my mind. And I'm curious what you all think. I think this is one way that we 100% celebrate each other, is making space for all voices, experiences, and start to take down some of these things. And so, Shelley, I'm going to kick it back to you, since you were just speaking about this, is how do we start taking on these structures in a way where we're empowered as a community to work together, we make space for everybody, all voices? How do we start doing that now that we're away from kind of that frantic sense of COVID, and now we're like, let's recommit to these things?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually love your word frantic, because I think that's one of the things that gets in our way, and we can't make these changes in a frantic way. We've got to be committed, stay committed, persist, persevere. And I can't, I'd love to hear both Sarah and Mason's perspective on this question, because for me, that at a very basic level, it starts with anything that we're doing, looking around to say, who's at the table, who's not at the table. Are we really taking the time to listen and to build something that's collaborative? And gosh, easier said than done. So just slowing down enough to be deliberate about being inclusive is one thing that I think that we don't have a tradition of doing here at DU yet.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shelley, for naming that and thinking about how we not only see who's there, but who's not there. And that's a really big question as we start to think about structures. And Mason, what are your thoughts around that piece? You mentioned that. Thank you again for talking about that.
No, of course. And I think that's a super interesting question, because I know for me personally, my background and my involvement off campus and kind of my involvement historically, I come from an activist background. I come from doing civil rights work on behalf of Indigenous people and advocating in these spaces. And in the wake of really what was the most challenging summer for our relationships between systemic oppression, the legacies of colonization, whether it's still these impacts, is one, also recognizing the impact that it had on students individually. I have students that I've spoken to where that summer has left a mark on them that probably is one of the deepest wounds that they've ever experienced. I also have people I've spoken to who have never thought of the idea that they thought we were a post-racial country. They thought we were, oh, I didn't know this was still happening. And of such a spectrum. And one of those things where I guess going forward, the idea of making those spaces, but also holding each other accountable to being brave enough to go into those spaces, have challenging conversations. There are students, and this is true across the country, but specifically at DU, there are students with every identity, with every background, who are mobilizing at this very moment to continue those conversations, to continue the work of advocacy for the rights of their identities, for the progression of our campus and our community. We need to give that support. We need to make sure that we're acknowledging just the fact that a lot of times our students are the ones who are putting in tangible hours a week just on looking at our campus initiatives, forging new spaces. I know as an Indigenous student, our freshman class and our transfers who have come in have bolstered our numbers of Indigenous presence on this campus. But what structures do we have to support them? What actions are we going to take as a community to support them? And our community being like our Indigenous students who are currently here, us upperclassmen. How are we going to support these younger freshmen and sophomores? Really challenging, but I think from a community level, recognizing the uniqueness of our situation and the need to keep challenging, keep pushing on some of these conversations. And yes, they're uncomfortable. Yes, they bring out some of our darker sides and the darker sides of some of our systems, but the payoff is, something that is amazing to think about. A better community in a better space that is safer for our students with these identities and these experiences. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mason. Yeah, we were having a brainstorm about community plus values work just before this, and we were saying, how do we gauge whether people are actually interacting with folks they might not normally talk to, whether it's a staff, faculty, student, or alumni member of our community. And that's a big goal, is that we have great supportive communities around our experiences and identities, but how do we start talking to one another and kind of begin to develop that empathy muscle and think about those things and take down those structures and build some things up, learn some new things and unlearn some things. And Sarah, I'd love to hear your thoughts and your expertise around this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the last thing that I would think about is just taking a growth mindset to the whole operation. So with respect to oneself and with respect to others, that there's no, there's no end for COVID in the immediate future, and there's no end really possible in terms of, we could think of a utopian ideal, but it's a long time coming. So I think if we can instead commit individually to continuing to push ourselves to grow and do the uncomfortable things, to accept feedback gratefully, graciously when it's offered, as a risky and difficult thing, right, for someone to do, and then to also extend to our colleagues the opportunity to grow, because it is tempting to other, right, to do othering and sort of feel like some things are not changeable or never changeable, and that actually won't help us. So I'll just give a personal example. Recently, when we first started getting our test results back on the return to campus, I was literally going from the spit pod like over to the lab, until late at night every day, the actual spit samples, and thinking about the samples and not the people. I said, this is amazing, they're all coming in really clean. And somebody said to me in a group forum, that implies that the opposite of that is that someone who has COVID is dirty. And I'm sure that's not what you meant, but somebody might hear it that way. So, I can take that feedback, that of course I don't want to hear that feedback. Of course I don't want anyone to feel that way. I don't want that to have been the implication. And just own that that was a bad choice of language. You know, it's important to be mindful of using the appropriate language, but you're not going to do it all the time. You're going to say the wrong thing, right? And be able to say in that forum, thank you for the correction, and to really be grateful for the opportunity to correct, and to be in a space where it's safe enough for somebody to say that, versus just leave feeling unvalued or unseen. So I'm trying to think about it that way, like, you know, can we create a space where it's safe enough to challenge each other and safe enough to grow, versus a space where we've achieved some idealistic end game goal.
Thank you for sharing that example and being vulnerable with our community and modeling that, because it's so hard, and it's so hard to say, that was not my intent, but I made that impact, and just owning up to that. And one of the things we're thinking about really deeply this year with the rest of our C+V programming is, what's the purpose of this conversation? So is it a growing space? Is it a supportive space? Is it a space for people to have dialogue? And we've learned that lesson from Ned on campus, who's a phenomenal human with DU Dialogues. And she talked about, like, what is the reason that we're all meeting together, and setting that up right away. So as folks are doing that and coming back together, I also think someone said we forgot how to be human, and we've seen it in the news of like airplane stories and people in traffic, and like we have to remember to be human together and care for each other again. And I think DU's doing that, but like remember that as we keep going. And I want to thank all the panelists so much for being with us here today. We will continue having our C+V Community Talks, and they will look different throughout the entire year. And I also want to give a shout out to the C+V Graduate Fellows. We have 4 new folks on the team, Hiba, Ryan, DJ, and Andrea, and we're so excited to have them on the team. So if you hear from them, they are representing C+V well. And a shout out again to Tremaine and the IT team, and Weston for always helping us put these together. From the moment Shelly joined us on our first one throughout this past year till right now. And I do want to let you know we have our first Heritage Months webinar coming up next week on Thursday from 11:30 to 12:30. We will be celebrating our Latinx community at DU, and it will be a very powerful session around how we really think about the future of the Latinx population. And we have some phenomenal speakers who identify as Latinx in our community and who have graciously agreed to speak. So we're really excited. Feel free to visit the website there. And we're honored to host that space with C+V. And then if you haven't got the chance yet, we encourage you to follow us on our social media channels. We post a lot on there about upcoming events and things all across campus. And then finally, we encourage you, if you have ideas, if you have structures you want to take on or build at DU, please feel free to reach out to us at Community Plus Values, plus spelled out, at du.edu. You'll see it on the screen there. Visit our website for more opportunities. But again, thank you so much for being with us in this space for the first one of the year, and wishing everybody a safe, healthy, and phenomenal rest of your week. Thanks so much for being here.